inviting me to speak today and to be here in Japan, and my utmost admiration to the organising committee of this wonderful event here in Hiroshima. It's wonderfully organised and is a credit to the peace movement all over the world. This is the first time I've had the opportunity of visiting Japan, and I have to say I'm grateful to everyone for their help and support and kindness whilst we've been here, and my great admiration for the Japanese peace movement, who I've met on many occasions. I've spent my life opposing nuclear weapons, and I want to emphasise my respect to all those that have organised this conference and this week's event. The world can learn a lot of lessons from the people of Japan and the people of this city and of Nagasaki. Unbelievable horror was visited upon those cities 80 years ago in 1945, and the people of those cities have commemorated with respect all those that lost their lives, but have also been an example to the rest of the world that in the face of that dreadful adversity there's been a determination to rid the world of nuclear weapons so that no other city anywhere in the world will ever be devastated in the way that this one was and Nagasaki was. Thank you to the people of both cities for all that they've done over the past 80 years. There's many references to the Yabakusha people and the way that they have spent their lives as survivors of the atomic bomb campaigning for peace. It was a very moving event at the sports arena yesterday, with the music, with the poetry, and with the reminiscences that people had. I was reading before I came here the story of Fujio Torikoshi. He was 14 years old when the bomb fell. He was eating his breakfast at his home on what would have been a relatively normal morning, albeit during the Second World War. He has no memory except that he was being lifted off the ground, even though he was more than 2 kilometres away from the explosion. Eventually, he woke up in hospital and was told by doctors that he would be very, very fortunate to live beyond the age of 20. He was then 14. He died in 2018 at the age of 86. I think that is a testament to the medical skills of all of the medical profession in Japan and in other countries that have managed to do so much to keep the victims alive, despite the cancers and all the other horrors that they suffered because of radiation. So this week we remember all of those who survived and all of those who died. And we thank them for their memory and thank them for the example they've given to the rest of the world. How you turn adversity into advantage by campaigning for a humanitarian and peaceful future for all of us on this planet. And I think we should never forget that. We'll no doubt be here again in future years. There will come a time when there are no more survivors left to speak. And so we'll have to remember and cherish what we heard yesterday and heard on so many other occasions. My own life's journey on nuclear weapons started when I was in school. Both my parents were people of peace. They met opposing the rise of fascism in Europe in the 1930s and spent their lives trying to build a peaceful world, a world where racism was no more and peace reigned. In our school, we were able to choose books to discuss in class, and each student was invited to choose a book and then read it and discuss it in class. It was a really good idea. The book I chose was called Brighter Than a Thousand Suns. It was the story of the atomic bomb and what happened. That book deeply moved me, because even though I'd been told what a nuclear weapon was, I didn't really understand it. I kept thinking it was sort of like a big bomb, like a big TNT bomb or something like that. I didn't fully appreciate what a thermonuclear explosion was. That book taught me differently. So when I was 14, I joined the campaign for nuclear disarmament. Out of fear of a nuclear war, which was then about to happen, over Cuba, and I've been a member of the campaign for nuclear disarmament ever since. And it's them I'm representing here today as one of the vice presidents of CND. And I met many wonderful figures in CND, none greater than the late Bruce Kent, who many of us have all known, who made an amazing contribution to the peace movement. And he said, I want to be optimistic because I don't think people are intrinsically violent. He inspired me and he inspired many others, even though he got a lot of criticism and a lot of attack from the media in Britain. And indeed, I understand that feeling because as a elected public representative in a country with nuclear weapons, those of us, and I can see Caroline in front of me, have suffered the same kind of abuse the whole time, being opposed to nuclear weapons because we don't want to see millions of people killed. We're interested in peace, not in the prosecution of war. That is why we want to see the world free of nuclear weapons. But it wasn't just the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that we remember. It must also be all those other victims of the effects of the war, the nuclear weapons that we used then, but also of the massive nuclear testing programs all over the Pacific, all over Central Asia, in what was then Soviet Central Asia, and in particular the western states of the USA. There are probably 2 million people that have died since 1945, not from the bombs that were dropped here in Japan, but from the nuclear testing program all over the world. And those are also victims of it. We should think of them as well, and they're continuing suffering. We have representatives of the Marshall Islands and others here, but there are many others around the world. When he was alive, I got to know Joseph Rotblat, who was the Polish physicist who worked on the Manhattan Project. And later, like many others who worked on the Manhattan Project, they felt they were dragged into it because they wanted to see an end to the Second World War. They were horrified at the Nazi war machine, and they felt that this was a way of ending the war. They didn't, in truth, realise the potential of the weapons they were developing. And so they then, many of them, became very, very fierce critics of nuclear weapons and nuclear war. And many of them have been the most powerful advocates for peace because they feel that what they were told was wrong at the time. And what Joseph Rotblat said was, there is no direct evidence that nuclear weapons prevented a world war. And they went on to say, above all, remember your humanity in the work that you do. I grew up in a period that there was a real possibility of a nuclear war. I mentioned the question of Cuba in 1962 and the arguable location of Soviet nuclear weapons in Cuba and the danger of a standoff. Eventually that standoff resulted in a deal and a nuclear war did not happen. As a result of that, changes did begin to take place because the world was afraid of the danger of a nuclear war, and it became real. And so from 1968 onwards, we had the development of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has its faults, that we all know, but it also has some quite amazing achievements behind it. The 5 declared nuclear weapon states, Britain, France, the then Soviet Union, United States, and China, agreed there would be no proliferation of their weaponry. They would take no steps to develop nuclear weapons, and no other country would be allowed to import the nuclear technology from them. It has its faults, and I'll come on to those in a moment. But we should also remember its achievements. One of the great achievements was in post-apartheid South Africa, led by the late President Mandela, they announced they would no longer develop any nuclear weapons and would completely disarm. That is one of the great legacies of Mandela, that he didn't seek to arm South Africa, he sought to disarm South Africa, to end apartheid and the horrors of that, and become a nation to develop itself for its people, not by threatening its neighbours and the rest of the world. He brought about the Treaty, which made Africa into a nuclear-free zone, and nuclear-free zones also followed in Latin America and Central Asia. Those treaties show us it is possible to achieve nuclear disarmament. It's possible for the majority of the world's nations to live without nuclear weapons. And so I think we have to continue our adherence to the NPT, but also now strengthen that by forcing all of our countries to sign the international treaty for the total elimination of all nuclear weapons. Any political figure that stands up against nuclear weapons receives a great deal of attention from right-wing press, particularly in Europe and North America, where it seems to be unusual to adopt the idea that the concept of security doesn't necessarily depend on your ability to kill people or destroy your neighbour. The concept of security is actually the ability to get on with your neighbour and be friends with your neighbour and not threaten your neighbour. It's a very unusual concept to many people with military minds in Western Europe and North America, and it sets us apart from the mainstream. I was elected leader of the Labour Party and of the official opposition in 2015. My whole life has been spent in the peace movement, and whilst the policy I inherited to become leader of the Labour Party was one that was actually in favour of nuclear weapons, I was not prepared to carry on with any support for nuclear weapons, whatever. And one of the first questions I was asked was, if you become Prime Minister, would you press the button to set off a nuclear explosion? I simply said, no. Of course I wouldn't. Why would anybody want to destroy millions of people all around the planet? And I was then heavily criticised for that, and was told by many of the media that I was actually a threat to Britain's security and a threat to the safety of the world, because I was not prepared to use nuclear weapons. I'm quite a thoughtful person, but I've been thinking about that one ever since, and I don't understand it. Not killing people is a threat of killing people. Work that one out. I haven't got much more time, there's much more I'd like to say. I just want to say this. The war in Ukraine is appalling. It is wrong in every respect, and there has to be a ceasefire. I want to pay respect to the Russian peace activists that have stood up against the war, just as much as I want to support the peace activists in every other country around the world. There is no military solution to the issue in Ukraine. The longer it goes on, the danger is that nuclear weapons will be brought into play, either by Russia or by NATO or by a combination of both. Yesterday in our statement at the end of this conference, we quite rightly drew attention to the situation in Gaza. Israel is a nuclear power. Israel does have nuclear weapons, and that's why all the campaigns we've done in the past for a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East are so important. But today we're witnessing a genocide of the Palestinian people. Let the message go out from here, from peace activists here in Japan, meeting in Japan on this anniversary. Stop the war, stop the fighting, have a ceasefire, bring in the aid, and above all, recognise the rights of the Palestinian people to be able to live in peace and justice in their own homes, in their own land. I want to conclude by saying this. The world spends $100 million every year on nuclear weapons. It spends $2.4 trillion a year on armaments as a whole. In the false belief that security comes from the strength of your arms, the size of your army, the ability to destroy people. And there is a massive industry all around the world which promotes that, called the arms industry, which often is accompanied by corruption and huge profits. Through the Peace and Justice Project, we produced a book called The Monstrous Anger of the Guns, based on the First World War poem by Wilfred Owen, which says what passing bells for those who die as cattle, only the monstrous anger of the guns. And so we have to challenge the arms industry and its power. We have to challenge the use of science to kill people rather than save lives. Einstein said, in the shadow of the atomic bomb, it has become even more apparent that all men are indeed brothers. That was the words he used at that time. So in memory of those that died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in memory of those that have suffered because of nuclear testing, and of those that have suffered great poverty all around the world, the lack of healthcare, education, housing, environmental sustainability, because of the resources that have been poured into the arms industry. That's resolved here on the 80th anniversary of that terrible day in 1945, that we will indeed build a world of peace, where we will share the resources rather than destroy the planet. We will develop programs on environmental sustainability that rather than environmental destruction. The responsibility falls on us to undertake that campaign to achieve that. Thank you very much.
奮い立つような思いがされているのではないでしょうか。今起こっている戦争、ガザでのジェノサイドをやめさせたい。そしてお金は軍事費ではなくて暮らしや持続可能な平和のために使いなさいと私たちの政府にも言いたいし、国会で議会でそういう活動をされている、その主張されている議員がイギリスにおられるということを大変私は嬉しく思いました。続きまして次の発言者です。ご紹介します。ジェレミーからお呼びです。おてんかさん、マーク・おてんかさん、よろしくお願いいたします。
Very much. It's a big honor to be able to address you here today. I was very touched as well by the different stories and experiences that were told by the Babusha. And having this kind of moments and mobilization in a time where indeed we see mass killing in a different way in Gaza, it is all the more essential. I was also very touched to be able yesterday to speak to some representatives from Vietnam who themselves have experience with weapons of mass destruction, which also is carried over through generations. And in this context, we need to be very clear that we do not want this kind of mass killing, this kind of, I would say, tragedy, but in reality crimes, to ever happen again. Now, after World War II, shocked by the horrors of World War II, and under pressure from people all over the world that were asking for peace, that were demanding never again, the world seemed to have learned lessons. Created the United Nations, Charter of the United Nations, peaceful conflict resolution, but also nationally, a number of countries, Italy for example, put in their constitutions that they would forever renounce war. Of course, Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution should be an inspiration for the entire world in this regard. Yet, the end of the Second World War also saw the start of an arms race, a dangerous arms race. The United States, of course, wanted to guarantee, fix the global domination, the strength, position of strength they were in after the Second World War. And after the A bomb came the H bomb, and came a number of nuclear tests Jeremy just mentioned. Soviet Union got the message, called up, and others would follow. Now, the dominant nuclear arms doctrine at the time, which in English is abbreviated MAD, mutually assured destruction, started from the philosophy, to simplify it, that each side should have enough nuclear weapons to make sure to guarantee total destruction if ever war broke out. Relying on the threat of retaliation, massive retaliation, to deter any attack. Now, of course, this criminal doctrine depended on threatening mass civilian casualties, taking hostage, basically, massive civilian population, and an endless build-up and modernization of nuclear arsenals. And in turn, of course, more countries were going to look for nuclear weapons. The US were looking for a first strike capability. Remember the missile shield projects of notably Ronald Reagan, and other countries that scrambled to get at least a second strike ability. Now the result was an arms race, nuclear proliferation, in spite of the many, let's say, good sides of the NPT and non-proliferation. But in the midst of all this madness, there was also people's mobilization and positive initiatives that came through. I think it was Ireland, a small European country, that took the initiatives that led in the end to non-proliferation. And the UN General Assembly proved up to the challenge. There was in Europe, say the West, the Helsinki process, which was pushed very strongly also at the time by the Soviet Union for reasons of borders, but in which also my country, Belgium, which is I think an even smaller country, or just a small country as Ireland, played a part, an active part through diplomacy, with someone who was a Christian Democrat, someone who was particularly progressive on other issues. But instead of focalizing just on like how can we arm more, they were going to look at economics, the environment, human rights, and human security. Now the idea was that security has to be collective, but also indivisible. Meaning that we can only feel secure and at peace if everyone is. Because this is, of course, the big paradox of any arms race. You buy or produce more weapons. The illusion you will be safer, but of course, the other sides, the other countries will do similarly. And in the end, you end up with more weapons, but less security. This would, in the end, pave the way, this Helsinki process, for a lot of disarmament and arms control treaties. That proved very important. And they showed to us that alternatives are possible, even in a big standoff that was the Cold War between two opposing blocs. And, if you allow me, they also show to population of small countries that they can play an instrumental role in this, and that hence mobilization is of the essence everywhere. Now today, these lessons, structures are being rapidly dismantled. You can see throughout the world that never more money has been spent on weapons. Year after year, records are broken, and these are not good records. And recently, the United States President Trump came to Europe within the framework of NATO to tell us we should all spend 5% of our GDP, of gross domestic product, on weapons. Not because we spend too little on arms, let's be clear. We grossly outspend most countries in the world. We outspend Russia, and if you look at NATO, I think together we spend 10 times what Russia spends, 4 times what China spends, more or less. We have more fighter jets, we have more tanks, we have more warships. So this is not about defense. This is about foreign intervention, and this is indeed about old school, I would argue, imperialism. EU countries, global West, have been undermining basic tenets of international law and the UN Charter for many years. If you look at the last 25 years, a number of military interventions by Western countries have undermined core principles of the UN Charter. You can go to the intervention in '99 in Yugoslavia. They invoked humanitarian reasons, but it was a violation of human rights. The Iraq War in 2003, the Libya War in 2011, or as many of you over the last few days have mentioned, the Israeli-American attack on Iran a few which is not only a violation of the UN Charter, but also weakens the regime of the NPT, because it basically stimulates proliferation. And now, as you know, Donald Trump wants to focus on China, as it considers the economic rise of China a threat to U.S. hegemony. And for this, he also wants to militarize the Indo-Pacific. And I've heard that after Trump came to Europe to tell us we need to massively increase our spending on weapons and take money away. I apologize to the interpreters, I'm jumping. Massively take away money from our pensions, our social security, our hospitals. He came to many Asian countries saying the same thing, of course to buy US weapons. Unfortunately, in Europe, the main establishment is following the United States rather blindly and passively, submissively, I would say. And there are even people dreaming of creating a nuclear first strike capacity by building a missile shield. Now, this missile shield will guarantee a lot of profits to the military-industrial complex. But I think the fact that the Israeli so-called Iron Dome, which was potentially the biggest or supposed to be the most effective missile defense system in the world, was basically not broken down, but at least there were holes in it. We saw with the Iranian missiles and drones going through. Shows that this will not guarantee security against any nuclear attack. So this is the dream. And we see that today in Europe, the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, is massively underfunded. Its annual budget is lower than the cost of an F-22 fighter jet. You cannot do it. And I will respect the time, so looking at the interpreters again to jump a paragraph, I apologize for this. But hope, and this has been true during the Cold War and is true today, comes from the people's mobilization, the collective action. We have seen, and I've seen here in the last few days, how the Japanese people mobilize for peace, how the value of peace is present everywhere in this city, from the Peace Promenade to the Peace Boulevard. I even saw, and as a Belgian whose national specialty is beer, I went to a local brewery and I saw they were brewing for peace. And this shows how deeply rooted the value is here in Hiroshima and in Japan. And I think together, and I will conclude on this, we have many campaigns to fight for. The fight against militarization, which is a fight we share on both sides of the ocean. The fight for the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which our countries, only 2 European countries joined it for the moment, signed it, which is Ireland and Austria. These are also 2 countries that historically are not members of NATO and proudly stand for their neutrality. We want to fight in Belgium also to remove US weapons, nuclear weapons from our territory, of which we have no control. They're completely dominated by the US. And finally, we need, let's say, a Helsinki process for this century, which will be different, of course, but at the same time can be inspired by very similar principles and values. So this is going to be a battle I'll really look forward to waging together with you. And I'm sure we have much to learn from each other, but more importantly, we will strengthen our common battles. Thank you again for having me.
というものが一体どういう役割を果たしてきたのか、また私たち自身がこの長い戦いの中で国連憲章や国際法を樹立する、そういう勢力に対して力を合わせてそれを跳ねのけていけるかということをお話しいただけたかと思います。で最後にいろんなやり方で、それぞれのやり方で平和の活動、戦争や核兵器に反対する活動はできるんだと。でビールで有名な小手賀さんのお国のベルギーでは ローカルな、ビールの醸造所でその平和のアピールをしているということを伺って本当にいろんなやり方で私たち候補者の目で活動してますのでまたそういったことも交流できればと思いました。はい、では3人目の発言者となりますマーティンさんです。ドイツからおいでで、EU の、欧州議会の、議員であります。マーティンさんお願いします。
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the invitation and also the occasion to speak here today. And I also want to thank Jeremy and Mark for their instructive contributions so far. I'm sure we will have a very profound discussion later together. But I would like to start with a little story I'd like to share. I was born in Berlin, and I will not speak about Cold War and the wall dividing the city, but I want to talk about a street in the neighborhood I grew up in. It's called Prenzlauer Berg. In Prenzlauer Berg, there's a street called Straße. By the way, that has been an anti-fascist activist, killed by the Nazis in the concentration camps. But in the street there grow Japanese cherry trees, a lot of them. And these cherry trees have been present by the Japanese state to the former GDR. And these, on the street, and the trees lead to a little park nearby, actually the apartment I live in. And in this park there is a little hut. And the hut resembles a temple or a Shinto shrine here in Japan. And beneath the roof there hangs a huge bell. And it's called Bell of Peace or Peace Bell. And every year on the 6th and the 9th of August people gather there in the park, and the bell is rung, and people commemorate actually what happened here in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I've been there many times myself since I've been a child. So being here today in Hiroshima is truly a deep honor for me. And to be here in this very city that marks, together with Nagasaki, one of the darkest chapters in human history. And we, you, us here, gather to remember the unspeakable suffering of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to honor the lives lost, but also to honor those who survived the dropping of the atomic bombs, and to say clearly, never again. And commemoration is not just about memory, it's also about responsibility. And I speak here as a politician, as a representative of my party, Die Linke, in the European Parliament. And responsibility means also to have a very clear look at what is going on internationally. And right now we are living through a time of profound international instability. And both Jeremy and Mark already touched upon this. The erosion of international law, actually once the foundation of the global order, is accelerating. Conflicts over markets, I call it imperialism, and I like to think of conflicts over markets, resources, and also geopolitical dominance are intensifying from Ukraine to the Middle East, from Kashmir to the South China Sea. The great power rivalries are re-emerging with the decline of US hegemony, with a new bloc confrontation between the US and also China, and also ambitions of powers, I would say little powers like Russia, which all contribute to renewed international tension and militarization. And meanwhile, NATO is investing massively into new weaponry and technologies, and Japan, the country we are now here to discuss actually what Hiroshima and Nagasaki mean for the peace movement nowadays, and to commemorate those from the past. Japan is breaking with decades of pacifist policies, and I'm sure Comrade Xi will tell us more about that. I would put it like this, quoting Dr. West, the famous French socialist, who said, "Capitalism carries war within itself like a cloud carries rain." And actually that metaphoric description is still right, profit-driven, and Mark already pointed out a little bit how much actually NATO intends to spend. Profit-driven militarism is fueling the arms race, the international arms race, and in this race, manufacturers will win, while people, democracy, and peace will only can only lose. And in Europe, we see this logic at play. We see it also here in Asia and in the US at play. NATO's 5% spending target calls for nuclear deterrence, nuclear armament, and also the establishment of the so-called European Defense Union. All this is being framed as security, and I will also include something that I did not provide the interpreters with, so sorry for that. I recently had the occasion to attend a meeting together with the, he's called General Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, and we could discuss actually the latest NATO summit. He gave a debrief to some parliamentarians, and I could also raise some questions. I think it's not necessary to say that he did not answer my questions. But there was one answer that he gave, not to one of my questions, but in the subtext. So I was asking him, who is going to pay for all of this? He said, well, you are the politician, you have to take the decisions. And then he said, I'm a liberal politician, I would not raise taxes for the rich. I would not go for loans and credits, but there are also other sources where you can find money. Clearly, what he was pointing at is that we should accept that militarization takes place at a scale we've never seen before, while our hospitals go underfunded, schools crumble, and social programs are cut. This is actually what he intended to say. But he did not say it clearly, he did not speak it out. But a new wave of austerity, this is something we need to understand, because this will affect our societies. A new wave of austerity policies will follow that military spending, and austerity hollows our societies from within and feeds. This is another aspect that we have to be aware of, feeds also the far right in their narrative, because militarism and authoritarianism go hand in hand, as the past has shown too often, and I hope that we will learn our lessons of the present and the future. And in my country, Germany, well, the situation is a bit, not different, it's a bit blurred, I have to say, because the population wants something else than the government does, and also the government that passed it. Germany continues to host US nuclear weapons. There is an estimation that we have like 15 US nuclear weapons on German ground, and Germany and all the governments refuse to sign a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, citing always then as an explanation its commitment to NATO's so-called nuclear deterrence. But actually, this is not what the people in Germany want. The majority of the people in Germany want. You should know that 2 out of 3 Germans want Germany to join that treaty. 2 out of 3. And more than 80% of the population want the US nuclear weapons removed from Germany. More than 80%. And yet, this government, like all the other governments before, continue to ignore the will of its people. And my party, and I can say this very proudly, my party, Die Linke, is the only peace party in the German Bundestag and also in the European Parliament standing up against this. And I'm so proud that we do this because we need to keep that space open in society, that other voices can be heard, and that there might be a chance for a change of course politics. This is our job, this is the role we have to play in Germany, but also in European politics, because humanity again stands at the crossroads. And this is not accidental, and not an accidental development, because as I already said, war is good business. defense spending is increasing higher than ever, and we need a different path. We are aiming at but also our group in the European Parliament, we are aiming at a Europe without weapons of mass destruction. We must reject the logic of bloc confrontation between the US and China, and instead we need a revival of the commitment to disarmament and foreign policy rooted in diplomacy, not domination. Security, sovereignty, and freedom in long term guarantees that only a world peace order based on international law can provide. And as internationalists, as socialists, we reject imperialism, whether it comes in Western or Eastern form. We want to build a society that values justice, healthcare, education, a society that is investing in peace and not in war. We strive for solidarity that puts people before profits and that stands up for a different world. We fight for a world where security and social justice go hand in hand. And this will be my concluding remarks. I had the occasion, it's my first time in Japan, I had the occasion to visit the Museum of Modern Art in Tokyo, and I saw for the first time one of the Hiroshima panels, was the second Hiroshima panel called Fire, and what is depicted there is like after the dropping of the atomic bomb, the fire is consuming the population of Hiroshima, and I'm aware that you cannot compare, let's say, arts or the present and the past, etc. Because context doesn't matter. But this picture, or this series of pictures, is very emblematic of this from a European perspective, as emblematic as Gandhi. And even though these pictures depict the most brutal scenes of war, the horrors of war, the message they carry is peace. The message these pictures carry is peace. So, dear friends, those who survived the concentration camps in Europe, like for instance my grandfather, and all those who suffered terribly from World War II in Europe are now only few in number, and their motto, never again, is not the right of all times. It's an obligation for socialists in Europe nowadays. And Hiroshima and Nagasaki are not only tragedies of the past, they are warnings to the present and to the future. And the Hibakusha are now also only few in number. And we cannot let their warning die with them as long as people continue to walk down the streets in Berlin, the cherry trees, and gather to commemorate the victims of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It is our responsibility to continue to walk the political way to build a world without nuclear weapons, without nuclear testing, to end the arms race, and to stand together across borders for the promise of non-violence and peace. I look very much forward to this.
軍事優先主義が台頭していく中で、拡大していく中で、極右が台頭してくると、そしてミリタライゼーション、軍事優先主義と権威主義、そして海外主義もここで含まれると思いますけれども、そういう潮流というのが、危険な潮流が今どこでも起こっている、私たちも日本でも実感している問題だと思います。そしてその恐怖、戦争の恐怖に対しては平和のメッセージに対抗していくんだ、力を合わせて共同の力で、運動の力で押し返していくんだということも力強く受け止めました。また安全保障というのはその社会正義、私たちが求めるのは人間の安全保障であり、それが社会正義と結びついたものでなければいけないんだというお話もあったと思います。で、おじい様のお話もされましたが、戦争体験、そして被爆者の体験、その記憶を語り継ぎ、そして絶対に繰り返さないということをするのが私たちの責務であるということも私たち深く受け止めたと思います。 はい、では続いての発言者です。アンライトさん、アメリカからお越しです。はい、元米軍大佐、イラク戦争に反対して辞任をした元米軍大佐であり、今は平和の活動家です。アンさん、お願いします。
Okay, well, thank you very much, and let me echo what other members of this panel have said about the great organization for this wonderful conference. Thank you all very, very much for, again, having this important time for us to discuss the dangers of nuclear weapons. Now, just start saying, I live in Honolulu, Hawaii, and this week we will be having commemorations of Hiroshima. I do this every time, my apologies. We also have a photo display in a very interesting place, the USS Missouri battleship, where the treaty or the capitulation, I guess, of the Japanese military in 1945 occurred. And on that battleship are photographs of Hiroshima. So there's a change. Well, I'm honored to be here. I'm not a parliamentarian, and as we call it in the United States, a member of Congress. However, I do spend a lot of time in Congress confronting members of our Congress, all parliamentarians here, and following them down hallways and chasing them and asking them questions about their positions on various issues, including the nuclear policies of the United States, and sometimes getting arrested in the U.S. Congress for chasing them down the hallway and asking them questions. In fact, next week in Washington, I have a trial for my latest arrest in the U.S. Congress. However, I will say there are some good U.S. congressmen and women, not many of them, but one of them that's ahead of the other 434 members of the U.S. Congress on nuclear policies is a fellow named Jim McGovern, who's always challenged the U.S. government's nuclear programs. Just 2 weeks ago, in July, Congressman McGovern said, I took to the House floor today with a simple message that we must act now to stop the growing threat from nuclear weapons. Global leaders need to return to the negotiating table to pursue arms control and disarmament. There is no alternative. And then my own U.S. representative from the state of Hawaii, a Japanese-American woman by the name Joan Kikuta, joined with Congressman McGovern to reintroduce a House resolution urging the United States to return to the negotiating table on disarmament and to lead a global effort to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. The resolution 317 reaffirms the United States moral and strategic obligation to prevent nuclear war and calls on the United States to pursue a world of nuclear weapons as a national security imperative. Most people don't realize that one member of Congress said that. McGovern also said, nuclear weapons do not make us safer. They put the entire planet at risk. We are closer to a nuclear catastrophe today rather than any other point since the Cold War. We need bold action to stop the nuclear arms race before it's too late. This resolution is a call for courage, diplomacy, and common sense. And Jill Takuda, my congresswoman, said, as a Japanese American, my heritage is deeply tied to the devastating impact of nuclear weapons and the atrocities of war. This resolution is about our moral imperative to achieve nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. It's not only a call for peace, but a commitment to ensuring that such tragedies are never repeated. This resolution represents a vital step toward a safer, more just world. The resolution urges the United States to engage in good faith negotiations with all nuclear armed states to halt the buildup of nuclear arsenals and pursue verifiable time-bound reductions, to conclude a new arms control agreement with Russia and engage China on nuclear risk reduction. It renounces the option of using nuclear weapons first. It ends the Cold War era hair trigger alert posture. It reins in the production of new nuclear warheads and delivery systems. It preserves the moratorium on nuclear testing. It protects radiation-impacted communities and workers through full remediation, compensation, and expanded health care. And it plans a just economic transition for workers and communities dependent on nuclear weapons. This renewed push comes amid the growing concerns that we've all identified here over a global nuclear arms race, the collapse of key arms control treaties, and rising tensions between major powers. And since the United States and Russia withdrew from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2019, many fear that this hard-won progress on arms control is unraveling. According to our U.S. Congressional Budget Office, the United States is projected to spend over $75 billion on nuclear weapons over the next decade, diverting critical resources away from, as you've mentioned, health, care, education, climate resilience, and more pressing national security needs. The resolution has received massive public support from across the United States. However, in the U.S. Congress, of 435 members of the House of Representatives, it only has 27 co-sponsors. Only 27. All from the Democratic Party. So, how do American citizens really feel about our Congress and their inaction? In a recent survey, Americans not only think that U.S. military leaders should be influential in making U.S. nuclear policy, but they also look to the military as a trusted source for information on nuclear weapons. I think that's pretty weird, but when asked how they trust the information they receive from other sources about nuclear weapons, the majority of Americans are more likely to trust the military. 55% say they trust the military than the president, which is 43%. And this isn't old, and I think they probably under Trump will say like 2%. But the Congress, do they trust the Congress? No, they don't trust parliamentarians. Only 37% of the people surveyed said that they trust the U.S. congressmen and women to provide accurate information. They also say that they trust academics that work hard on research about nuclear weapons at about the same rate as they trust military leaders. So this suggests, at least in surveys, that Americans are more likely to trust the information they receive from experts in nuclear power and warfare than our political representatives. So a warning to all of you all that are parliamentarians. Your communities may not trust you. So, to conclude though, our U.S. congresspersons must do more to stop my country's nuclear weapons refurbishment and development. Parliamentarians in NATO countries, you guys, should try to stop the U.S. from convincing your governments that nuclear weapons can destroy your countries, particularly you, Mr. Security, go after the U.S. elements. Because right now, in Lincoln Heath, they are saying, Lincoln Heath Air Force Base, the U.S. is already building bunkers to put nuclear weapons. And in fact, this summer was a wonderful encampment at Lincoln Heath where citizens from the UK and other places around the world came to protest the fact that these nuclear weapons are going back into Lincoln Heath. So, the bottom line is that, let's see, the bottom line is that in the United States, we also have some things that are very interesting about peace. And Martin mentioned right here that there's a peace sphere here in Japan. Well, in the United States, we have peace ice cream. And our good friend, Ben Cohen of Ben and Jerry's Ice Cream. How many have had Ben and Jerry's Ice Cream? Yeah, there we go. piece. And he has a piece ice cream, and he also has just had a new program called Up in Arms, which is a big two-story thing that talks about nuclear weapons and stopping nuclear weapons. And in fact, Joseph Gerson and his team from Boston this weekend are having stop nuclear weapons with this massive building in Boston, Massachusetts. So not only do we have beer for peace, we've got ice cream for peace. And so to conclude though, I think the old Albert Einstein, the scientist, he initially wrote a letter or signed a letter to President Roosevelt saying that the United States should develop an atomic weapon. But later he said that was not a good idea. He said, I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones, meaning that if World War III starts, nuclear weapons will be used, and anybody that's left on Earth will have nothing left but sticks and stones. So for us, let's stop those nuclear weapons. Thank you.
皆さんありがとうございました。議員ではないけれども、議会に対しての働きかけをするという、その活動を通じて、この議員の皆さんも叱咤激励される発言で、大変刺激的だったなというふうに思います。また、平和のビールが、ベルギーでは平和のビール、アメリカでは平和のアイスクリームがあるということで、いろんな形で平和のアピール、戦争反対、核兵器廃絶をと市民の行動ができるということもおっしゃっていただきました。はい、そして、そうですね、それで議会とか政府が信用されていない、あまりアメリカの世論調査ですけれども、やはり私たちの要求を議会でそれを取り上げて働く議員っていらっしゃるので、そういう議員を増やしていかないと、その議会が自分たちにとってどういう意味があるのかと信用しなくなるのではないかなというふうに思います。で、その日本の議会で、次にお話しいただきます、日本の議会衆議院議員として活動されております、日本共産党の上院会議長でもあります、C. 和夫さんです。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
皆さんおはようございます。日本共産党の C. 和夫です。広島長崎被爆80周年の年に、はるばる大陸を越えて、原子爆禁止大会に、世界大会に参加されたイギリス、ベルギー、ドイツ、アメリカの友人の皆さん、素晴らしいプレゼンテーションをしてくださった皆さんに、私からも心からの歓迎と敬愛の気持ちをお伝えしたいと思います。今、世界は文字通り、戦争か平和かの歴史が岐路に立っています。世界の平和進歩勢力の連帯がこんなにも求められているのではないと思います。私は今、私たちが共通して直面している4つの死活的な課題についての国際連帯を訴えたいと思います。第1は核兵器の廃絶です。核兵器使用の深刻な危険が起こっています。ロシアによる核兵器の威嚇、アメリカやイスラエルによるイランの核施設への攻撃、そして核保有国とその同盟国で核戦力強化の暴走が起こり、新たな核文化競争が起こっています。日本でも日米共同で核兵器使用を想定した演習が行われ、核共有の議論が横行しています。その全てに対して私は強い抗議の声を上げたいと思います。同時に大きな希望があります。核兵器集約の協会です。すでに批准73カ国、署名94カ国に上り、 公式に賛成表明をした国を加えますと、138カ国、国連加盟国の 70% に達し、国際法として堂々たる地位を占めています。この画期的条約をどうやってより実効あるものにしていくか、その大きな鍵は、核兵器の保有国とその同盟国、すなわちここに集う私たちの5つの国を含む国々の世論を変え、勢力を変え、禁止条約に参加することにあると思います。そしてそのための最大の鍵は、核抑止力論の克服にあります。核兵器禁止条約は、ノーベル平和賞を受賞した被爆者の皆さんを先頭にした核兵器の非人道性の告発、人道的アプローチが実を結んだものでした。そして核兵器の非人道性を批判することと、いざとなったら核兵器の使用のボタンを押すことを前提とする核抑止力論は決して両立するものではありません。人道的アプローチは核抑止力論を乗り越える大きな力になると私は確信するものです。同時に私たちが国会でこの問題を提起しますと、日本政府は安全保障環境が悪いという言い訳を持ち出します。しかし安全保障の観点からも核抑止力論は合理性を持つでしょうか。核兵器禁止条約の第3回締約国会議の報告書が提起したように、いかなる立場に立つ国であれ、核兵器はすべての国家の安全に対する深刻かつ根本的な脅威であることは誰も否定することができない事実です。そしてこの報告書が指摘しているように、核抑止が失敗する可能性があるという事実には疑いの余地はありません。それはキューバ危機をはじめ、あと一歩で人類の破滅をもたらした過去の歴史が証明していることではありませんか。私たちは今こうして存在していること自体が幸運に過ぎないのです。それぞれの国で核抑止力論を打ち破り、核兵器禁止条約3回の多数派を形成し、禁止条約に参加する流れを作り出そうではありませんか。私はそのための国際連帯を心から訴えるとともに、唯一の戦争被爆国である日本がその先頭に立てるように全力を挙げることをここで強調したいと思います。第2は国連憲章に基づく平和秩序の構築です。世界は平和秩序の面での深刻な挑戦に直面しています。トランプ前政権はガザ、ウクライナ、イラン、パナマ運河、グリーンランド、地球上の至るところで国連憲章と国際法を無視した言動を繰り返しています。ロシアによるウクライナ侵略を速やかに終わらせるための和平が必要です。同時に和平は国連憲章と国際法、一連の国連総会決議に基づく公正な和平でなくてはなりません。イスラエルによるガザへのジェノサイド、死者6万人を超え、恐ろしい栄養失調と餓死が住民と子供たちにもたらされ、援助を求める人々への無法な攻撃が行われていることを、私は最も強い言葉で非難します。一刻の猶予も許されません。国際社会の実効ある行動が必要です。イスラエルの戦争犯罪を止める国際的制裁が必要です。パレスチナ国家承認が急務です。フランスが踏み出し、イギリスも表明し、カナダも表明しました。日本政府は何をグズグズしているのか。日本もパレスチナ国家承認に直ちに踏み出すことを私は強く求めたいと思います。力による秩序の押し 押し付けでなく、国連憲章と国際法に基づく平和秩序を作るための国際連帯を私はこれから呼びかけるものです。第3は、大軍拡に反対する戦いです。ユーラシア大陸の東とにして深刻な軍拡競争が起こっています。トランプ政権の守ってほしいなら軍事費を増やせという恫喝に屈し、NATO は6月の首脳会議で軍事費を GDP 比 5% に引き上げることを決定しました。日本でも GDP 比 2% に向けて空前の大軍拡が進行中ですが、トランプ政権から GDP 比 3.5% という目標が押し付けられています。この道は国民の暮らしと決して両立できないものです。日本では大軍拡予算によってすでに社会保障、教育、中小企業、農業など暮らしの予算の深刻な圧迫がもたらされていますが、GDP 比 3.5% ならば、その影響は文字通り破滅的なものになるでしょう。同時にこの道は決して平和をもたらしません。それが安全保障のジレンマ、軍事対軍事の悪循環をもたらすことは、日本でも欧州でもその現実が証明しているではありませんか。戦争の準備でなく平和の準備が必要です。私たちは ASEAN と協力して東アジアを戦争の心配のない地域にする平和交渉を提唱し実践しています。その精神が軍事でなく対話、排除でなく包摂によって平和を創造することにあります。私は欧州の地方左翼勢力の皆さんが厳しい情勢のもと大軍拡にきっぱり反対する旗を小さな目にかけ奮闘していることに対し、熱い連帯と気持ちをここで表明したいと思います。平和を暮らしも壊す大軍拡に反対し、外交によって平和を創造する国際連帯を強めるのではありませんか。最後です。第4に、極右排外主義との戦いです。欧州米軍に続き、日本でも起こっているこの逆流から人間の平等と人権を擁護することは、それぞれの国の国内問題にとどまるものではありません。それは重要な国際問題であり、国際連帯の課題ではないでしょうか。諸国民の暮らしが苦しいのは、外国人のせいでも、移民難民のせいでもありません。一握りの大金持ちの利益を優先し、多数の国民の暮らしを踏みつけにする社会システム、新自由主義の経済政策にこそ、その根源があります。そして、極右排外主義が侵略戦争につながったことは、日本と欧州共通する歴史の教訓ではないでしょうか。その対等を許さない国際連帯を私は心から呼びかけたいと思います。このフォーラムに沿った5つの国、イギリス、ベルギー、ドイツ、アメリカ、そして日本、この5つの国が変われる。世界は間違いなく変わります。力を合わせて核兵器のない世界を作りましょう。戦争の心配のない世界を作りましょう。すべての人々の人権と尊厳が尊重される世界を作ろうではありませんか。以上をもって最初の議論です。
今回ありがとうございました。多くにわたって国際連帯を強めていこう、報道を強めていこうという呼びかけいただきました。そしてここにいる国々が、5つの国が変われば世界は変わるとおっしゃいました。でその変える力は、私たち市民の草の根の運動、そしてそれを国会で取り上げ、そしてプッシュしていく議員の存在かなというふうに思いました。はい、そしてここからお約束した通り5分間とお約束をお願いして、5分間休憩を取ると 申し上げていたんですが、ちょっと自分的な事情がございまして、10分間休憩を飛ばします。大変時間が押しているところ申し訳ないんですけれども、ここから10分間休憩を取る間に皆さんどうぞ質問やコメントを用意いただければと思います。それでは、12時5分前に、再開をいたしますので、お席の方に、11時5分です。はい、11時5分前、10時55分に再開いたしますので、その時にはお席にお戻りください。